By May of 1945, the German war machine was in free fall. Berlin was a smoking ruin under Soviet artillery. Hitler had already blown his brains out in his bunker, and the once unshakable Reich was reduced to scattered units fighting for reasons no one could explain anymore. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army's policy was simple: advance, burn, repeat. On the Western Front, the Americans and British were rolling through villages like a lawnmower over weeds. The German army, such as it still existed, was no longer one coherent force. It was more like a busted jigsaw puzzle. Some pieces still locked into place, some scattered on the floor, and a few jammed where they didn't belong. And at this point, the Germans were making choices based less on strategy and more on survival. Here's the oversimplified but useful distinction. You had the Wehrmacht, the regular German army, made up of career soldiers, draftees, and anyone who wore a uniform but didn't necessarily pledge their soul to Hitler. Then you had the Waffen-SS, the true believers, the Nazi Party's private army. If you were Wehrmacht at the end of the war, you could usually surrender and hope for a decent treatment. The Allies, for all their faults, generally knew the difference between a soldier who shot at them on a battlefield and one who organized mass executions. The Waffen-SS didn't have that luxury. Their track record read like a war crimes greatest hits album: massacres, executions, concentration camp duty. They were in too deep, and they knew it. For them, the end game was fight to the death, run for the hills, or eat a bullet before someone else could drag them into Nuremberg. So in the chaos of May 1945, you had Wehrmacht troops surrendering in droves, SS diehards digging into mountain passes, and civilians just trying to survive whoever came through town first. You can imagine the confusion when pockets of Germans started fighting other Germans just to avoid being associated with the SS. The lines between enemy and ally were blurring in the strangest ways. And it's in this chaotic twilight of the war that one of the strangest stories in military history unfolded. It involves an old Austrian castle, a handful of Americans, a defected Wehrmacht major, a few Austrian resistance fighters, a wounded ex-SS officer who had enough of the Nazis, and a group of very confused French VIP prisoners who had been sitting in a castle arguing with each other for years. Yes, you heard that right. Americans and Germans fighting together on the same side. Not a handshake ceasefire, not a quick truce in the trenches, an actual battle where US soldiers and Wehrmacht troops stood shoulder to shoulder and shot at the SS. If you ever wanted proof that history is stranger than fiction, this is it. But before we get into the castle itself, it's worth underscoring just how absurd the setting was. Imagine you're an American tank lieutenant. The war is basically over. Your buddies are cracking open captured wine cellars, and suddenly a German officer shows up waving a white flag saying, "Hey, want to go rescue some French politicians from the SS?" It sounds like the setup for a bad joke. Yet this is exactly what happened. The Battle of Castle Itter has been called the strangest battle of World War II, and for good reason. Where else do you get a cast list that includes Charles de Gaulle's sister, two French prime ministers who couldn't stand each other, a star tennis player, American tankers, German defectors, and a last-ditch SS assault? It's a story so weird that when Lieutenant John Jack Lee was asked about it years later, he didn't bother with flowery speeches. He just said it was the damnedest thing. And he wasn't wrong. Castle Itter looked like something from a postcard. A stone fortress perched in the Austrian countryside, towers jutting up against the Alps. It had been standing since the 13th century, but by the 1940s, its medieval charm was less important than its practicality. One road in, thick walls, and enough space to stash people you didn't want going anywhere. When the Nazis annexed Austria, they grabbed the castle and eventually folded it into the Dachau concentration camp system. But this wasn't Dachau proper. Itter became a prison for very specific prisoners, France's political and cultural elite. The Germans wanted to keep those people alive, healthy, and locked up. Why? Bargaining chips. If you've got former presidents, prime ministers, and generals in your pocket, you never know when they might come in handy. By 1943, the guest list included heavy hitters. former French President Albert Lebrun, two prime ministers, Charles de Gaulle's own sister, several generals, and even Jean Baroda, a tennis champion turned national celebrity. On paper, it sounds like an all-star lineup. In practice, it was like locking Democrats, Republicans, and celebrity athletes in a house and expecting them to play nice. They despised each other so much that escape was basically impossible. Every attempt at cooperation turned into a shouting match. Conditions were bizarre by concentration camp standards. Each prisoner had a room, they could walk the halls, exercise in the courtyard, even request books or better food if the guards felt generous. It was less Auschwitz and more Velvet Prison. But don't let that fool you. They were still captives of the SS, living under the shadow of Dachau, and they knew the situation could turn ugly at any moment. And turn ugly it did. As the Reich started collapsing in spring 1945, the SS grew more desperate. Kassel-Litter, still technically part of Dachau, was run by an SS officer named Sebastian Wimmer. Supplies dwindled, guards got jumpy, and the prisoners began to wonder if they were going to end up executed as loose ends. One French general later described the tension as living in a fortress that felt like a trap with no door. They weren't wrong. The trap was about to snap shut, except the people who sprung it weren't the Allies. It was the SS themselves. By April 1945, Kassel-Litter was more than just a strange prison. It was a pressure cooker. The Reich was unraveling, and the SS garrison at the castle could see the writing on the wall. Supplies dried up, the generator went dark. The prisoners who had once been given decent treatment were now hearing the distant thunder of artillery and wondering how long they had left. The man technically in charge was SS officer Sebastian Wimmer. Like most mid-level SS, he wasn't about to go down swinging for Hitler. He was about survival, his own. And his boss wasn't helping matters. On April 30th, none other than Edvard Weiter, the infamous butcher of Dachau, showed up at Itter. He had just overseen the execution of thousands of prisoners as Dachau collapsed, and then decided to hole up in the castle. The same night, Hitler killed himself in Berlin. Weiter, facing the fact that there was no future for Dachau commandants, pulled out a pistol and ended it himself inside Kassel-Litter's walls. His men tried to bury him in the local churchyard down in the village, but the priest flatly refused. "You don't dump a mass murderer in consecrated ground, thank you very much." So they stuck him in an unmarked grave just outside the castle walls. A fittingly ignoble end for the butcher. The effect on Wimmer was immediate. If that guy was checking out early, what was the point of staying? On May 4th, Wimmer decided to run. The prisoners reminded him of his earlier promise, that if the situation turned dire, he'd see to their safety. His version of safety was laughable. He handed off responsibility to a single wounded SS soldier who had already abandoned the party, then vanished with the rest of the guards. So by sundown, May 4th, Kassel-Litter was an armed VIP lounge with no staff. Imagine being one of those French politicians. You wake up a prisoner of the SS, and by dinner you're standing in a medieval courtyard holding a rifle, waiting for other SS units to show up. Because that's what everyone knew would happen. The SS were retreating through Austria, desperate and concerned. Leaving a fortified castle with famous prisoners inside was never going to be an option. The French scoured the armory, passed out weapons, and for the first time since their captivity began, they weren't helpless. But they weren't stupid either. A handful of aging generals, politicians, and one tennis player weren't going to hold out long against a determined SS attack. They needed help, and fast. That's when the Yugoslav electrician, Andreas Andrei Krobat, became the unlikeliest hero of the war. When the guards fled, the French prisoners knew they had a brief window. The SS weren't going to just forget about the castle full of VIP hostages. Reinforcements would come, and when they did, it would likely mean executions. Their only chance was to get the word to the Americans, who were sweeping across Austria village by village. The problem? None of the French prisoners could just stroll out of the gate. They needed someone expendable, someone the SS wouldn't immediately recognize or shoot on sight. That someone turned out to be Andreas Krobat, better known simply as Andre, a Yugoslav forced laborer who had been conscripted as the castle's electrician. He wasn't a politician, he wasn't a general, he wasn't even French, but he was loyal to the other prisoners, and more importantly, he had a motorcycle. On May 4th, the VIPs scribbled a desperate note in English. "We are prisoners at Castle Itter. The SS will kill us. Please send help." They handed the note to Andre, who revved up his bike and headed into the countryside. His job was simple: find Americans, show them the note, and pray someone believed him. It didn't take long for Andre to hit his first obstacle. Just outside a nearby village, he ran into Austrian resistance fighters. These weren't ragtag kids with shotguns. They were organized civilians and deserters who had been harassing German units for weeks. Their leader was a man named Josef Sepp Gangl. Gangl was no ordinary turncoat. He had been a Wehrmacht officer since the early days of the war, fighting the Soviets on the Eastern Front and later the Americans in Normandy. He was tough, experienced, and by 1945 completely disillusioned with the Nazi cause. Instead of surrendering outright, he joined local resistance fighters in protecting civilians from retreating SS units. When Andre explained the situation, French VIPs trapped in a castle, SS sure to attack, Gangl immediately understood the stakes. He also understood his limits. With only a couple dozen men, he couldn't take on the SS alone, but he knew the Americans could. So the plan split in two. Andre would continue his ride west until he ran headlong into US forces. Gangl, meanwhile, would drive north under a white flag, hoping to make contact with an American tank battalion. Two desperate messengers, one Yugoslav laborer and one German major, racing in opposite directions to find the same army. For the French prisoners back at the castle, there was nothing left but to wait, rifles in hand, staring down the empty road. They didn't know if Andre would succeed, if Gangl would be shot as a spy, or if the SS would show up first. What they did know was this: the strangest alliance of World War II was about to be born, and it all hinged on whether a lone electrician on a motorcycle could get the message through in time. Major Sepp Gangl drove into the American lines waving a white flag, under which normal circumstances would have been a quick way to get shot. But the 23rd Tank Battalion was already used to weird encounters in Austria. Villages full of surrendering Germans, deserters walking with their hands up, even civilians begging for protection from retreating SS units. Gangl wasn't the first Wehrmacht officer to throw himself on American mercy, but his pitch was unique. "I need your help. The SS are going to massacre a castle full of French VIPs." That got attention. The story reached First Lieutenant John Jack Lee, Jr., a 27-year-old Sherman tank commander. Lee wasn't exactly polished. One French prisoner later described him as crude in both looks and manners, but he was fearless and, more importantly, bored. He fought through France, Germany, and into Austria. Now the war was clearly in its final act, and instead of resting on his laurels, Lee jumped at the idea of one last fight. Lee volunteered on the spot to lead a rescue. His friend and fellow tank commander, Lieutenant Harry Basse, also insisted on joining. Their battalion added a handful of men from Company D of the 17th Armored Infantry Battalion, 6 black volunteers who were eager for action. It wasn't a big force: 2 Shermans, a few Jeeps, and Gangl's ragtag band of Wehrmacht defectors and Austrian partisans. But it was something. Pause for a moment and look at the lineup. American tankers, barely out of their 20s, an ex-Wehrmacht major now fighting against his own countrymen, Austrian civilians turned resistance fighters, African-American infantrymen who had to volunteer to be included at all because segregation was still official policy, and soon a French tennis champion waiting in a castle with a rifle. If you pitched this as a war movie, you'd be laughed out of the room for being unrealistic. Yet here they were, forming up in the shadow of the Alps, preparing to march on Castle Itter. Their route wasn't simple. The SS had mined bridges, set up roadblocks, and were prowling the countryside in scattered groups. Every mile was a gamble, but Lee's philosophy was simple: drive fast, hit hard, and don't give the SS time to regroup. So this strange coalition, Americans, Germans, and Austrians, rumbled toward the castle, engines growling, guns at the ready. They weren't just racing the clock, they were racing history, about to create the only battle in World War II where the US and Wehrmacht soldiers would fight side by side. And for the French prisoners waiting inside the walls, their rescuers were not what they expected. The road to Castle Litter wound through alpine valleys and thick forests, exactly the kind of terrain an ambush loves. Lee's little task force hit its first big problem 4 miles from the castle, a bridge wired with explosives. If the SS blew it, the Americans had no way to bring armor up the hill. Luckily, Gangel's men were still German soldiers at heart. They knew the wiring, the detonators, the tricks of their own engineers. Within minutes, the charges were diffused and the bridge was safe to cross. Not long after, the column rounded a bend and stumbled into an SS roadblock. Gunfire cracked and Lee's Sherman roared forward, scattering the defenders before they could finish setting up. For the first time, the coalition fired as one. Wehrmacht defectors and American tankers shot shoulder to shoulder, pushing through the resistance and racing up the road. By the time they reached the castle, the sun was going down. Inside the walls, the French prisoners had been watching nervously for hours. When the gates finally opened, they expected a column of Americans, maybe a battalion, maybe more. Instead, what rolled in was 1 Sherman tank, 7 American soldiers, and about 20 German troops. Imagine the shock. These were the men and women who had spent years in Nazi captivity, only to see Wehrmacht uniforms marching in alongside US armor. To them, it looked like the SS had arrived disguised as rescuers. Suspicion gave way to confusion, then grudging acceptance. At least they weren't being executed on the spot. Lee, Bassey, and Gangel quickly explained the situation. The Americans were stretched thin, reinforcements might come, but for now, this strange coalition was it. They weren't here to evacuate the prisoners, they were here to hold the castle until more help arrived. So they set to work. Lee positioned his Sherman directly in the gateway, blocking the only direct entrance. Gangel's Wehrmacht soldiers covered the outer walls, setting up firing positions. French generals took rifles and climbed to the ramparts, while politicians awkwardly handled pistols. Even Jean Baroda, the tennis star, grabbed a weapon and volunteered for lookout duty. And then, in one of the strangest moments of the entire war, they raided the castle's wine cellar. Americans, Germans, Austrians, and French VIPs sat in a medieval fortress, passing bottles back and forth, drinking together on the eve of battle. One witness later described it as a bizarre party before the storm. But everyone knew what was coming. The SS weren't far away. By nightfall, tracer fire would light up the walls of Castle Litter, and this improvised garrison, the strangest alliance of World War II, would be fighting for their lives. The SS came just before midnight. First it was distant movement in the tree line, shadows shifting under the pale moonlight. Then the staccato chatter of machine guns echoed across the valley, rounds sparking against Castle Litter's stone walls. Tracer fires stitched the sky, red and green streaks carving arcs between the dark forest and the medieval fortress. The defenders, Americans, Wehrmacht defectors, Austrian partisans, and a gaggle of French VIPs who'd barely touched a rifle in years, snapped awake and returned fire. The Battle of Castle Litter had begun. At first, it was a probing assault. The SS sprayed the walls, testing for defenses, waiting for a weakness. But Lee's men and Gangel's soldiers held the ground, answering with disciplined bursts. French generals who had once commanded divisions now crouched behind crenellations, working bolt-action rifles with practiced precision. Beside them, Jean Baroda, France's tennis darling, lined up shots as if he were playing Wimbledon with bullets. The fight raged through the night. Sporadic bursts of gunfire kept everyone awake, nerves stretched thin. It wasn't a battle of maneuver, it was a siege in miniature, a medieval standoff updated with 20th century hardware. Then dawn came, and with it, escalation. The SS rolled up an 88mm gun, one of the most feared weapons of the war. Originally built as an anti-aircraft cannon, it had earned a reputation as a tank killer. Against castle walls, it was devastating. The first shell slammed into the fortress, blowing a hole through stone and plaster. Rooms collapsed, dust filled the air, and fragments tore into the courtyard. Then the gunners shifted their aim to the Sherman tank blocking the gate. The hit was brutal. The shell ripped straight through the tank's armor, nearly killing the radio operator inside. He barely scrambled out before the fuel ignited, turning the Sherman into a burning metal coffin wedged in the gateway. The tank was now just a smoldering barricade, useful cover, but no longer a weapon. With their artillery roaring, the SS pushed harder. Machine gunners poured fire into the walls. Squads crept forward with grappling hooks, trying to scale the battlements. Defenders leaned over the ramparts, blasting down at silhouettes as they tried to climb. It was chaotic, desperate, and utterly surreal. Americans and Germans firing together to stop other Germans from storming a medieval fortress. In the thick of it, Major Sepp Gangl, the Wehrmacht officer who had defected, the man who risked everything to protect civilians, moved through the castle, coordinating positions and steadying his men. Then, as he leaned from cover to help direct fire, a sniper's round found him. Gangl crumpled instantly, killed in action. His death hit hard. For the Americans, he was proof that not every German soldier had been a Nazi. For the Austrians, he was already a hero, a man who had turned his back on tyranny when it mattered most. His body was pulled back inside and the fight went on. The SS pressure mounted as the morning wore on. The defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, and dangerously low on ammunition. Lee ordered the French politicians to retreat into safer parts of the castle, but they refused. They had been passive prisoners for too long. Now they were part of the fight, firing alongside soldiers, refusing to hide while others defended them. For hours the firefight raged, the castle shaking under artillery blasts, walls chipped away by relentless machine gun bursts. Smoke, dust, and the acrid smell of burning fuel filled the air. By late morning, the situation was grim. Ammunition stocks were dwindling fast. The defenders had beaten back multiple assaults, but the SS showed no signs of quitting. Each lull in fire was just a setup for another push, and with their tank destroyed and Gangl dead, the defenders were running out of both hardware and hope. Lieutenant Jack Lee sized up the situation. If relief didn't come soon, Castle Itter would fall. His plan for the endgame was as crude as it was desperate. Knives, fists, and hand-to-hand fighting in the narrow stairwells and stone chambers of the keep. If the SS broke through, they'd be met not by surrender, but by men willing to go down swinging in a literal medieval brawl. The defenders were exhausted, their nerves fraying, but they kept fighting. Each hour they held out increased the odds that Andre's desperate ride or Gangl's gamble with the Americans had paid off. But even the most stubborn garrison can only hold so long. By noon on May 5th, the walls of Castle Itter were still in friendly hands, but its defenders were running on fumes. The SS prepared for another push, and inside the castle, one French prisoner, Jean Baroda, the tennis star, decided it was time to gamble everything on a sprint through hell. By midday on May 5th, the defenders of Castle Itter were holding by sheer willpower. They had fought through the night, watched the walls buckle under 88mm fire, and seen their tank reduced to a flaming barricade. Major Sepp Gangl was dead, ammunition was running low, and the SS weren't letting up. Every lull in the shooting was only a chance for the attackers to regroup before the next assault. Inside the castle, the situation was tense. Spent casings littered the floor. The smell of cordite mixed with smoke and dust, and nervous French politicians muttered prayers between bursts of rifle fire. Lieutenant Jack Lee walked the walls like a man already resigned to dying there, barking orders with the calm of someone who knew there weren't many moves left on the board. It was clear they were running out of time. The SS had pushed close enough to throw grappling hooks, and several had nearly made it over the walls before being shot down. At one point, a German soldier actually scrambled to the top of the battlements, only to be clubbed and shoved back into the moat below. The defenders were literally one bad volley away from being overrun. Lee knew it. He started preparing the French VIPs for what he called the last option. If the ammo ran out completely, the plan was to fall back into the castle's narrow stairwells and hallways. Knives, Fists, bayonets, broken bottles, anything that could be swung would be used. It was brutal, but it made sense. A fortress designed in the Middle Ages was perfect for hand-to-hand ambushes. If they were going down, they'd do it like knights, only with less chainmail and more desperation. But not everyone was ready to sit and wait for the end. Jean Barotra, France's tennis champion, wasn't built for passivity. He was fast, athletic, and had spent his life moving, not crouching. As the defenders argued about dwindling ammunition, Barotra volunteered to do something insane, run through enemy lines to find the Americans and guide them back. Lee didn't like it. The chances of Barotra surviving a sprint through a forest full of SS riflemen were slim. But with no other options, he gave the nod. At the next lull in gunfire, Barotra vaulted the wall like he was leaping for a serve, hit the ground running, and disappeared into the woods. One French general later remarked that it was the fastest anyone had ever seen him move, and that was saying something for a tennis star. Somehow, Barotra made it. He zigzagged through the trees, dodged patrols, and covered several miles before finding the American relief column under Major John Kramer. Out of breath, but very much alive, Barotra insisted on guiding them back himself. Back at the castle, though, no one knew he had succeeded. The defenders assumed he was dead. By early afternoon, they were down to their last clips. French generals were firing rifles they hadn't touched since 1940. Americans were rationing machine gun bursts, and Wehrmacht defectors were yelling encouragement as they reloaded scavenged weapons. Then came a strange twist of fate. The castle phone rang. Yes, in the middle of a firefight, someone picked up. The line connected to the nearby town of Wargel, where Kramer's men had set up. After a few confused exchanges, Lee himself grabbed the receiver, shouting over gunfire as he described the situation. "We're out of ammo. Get here now." Relief was finally on the way. But inside the walls, no one could be sure they'd last long enough. The SS were regrouping for another push, ammunition was nearly gone, and exhausted men braced for a final stand. Some began sharpening bayonets. Others gripped knives with white knuckles. At around 3 p.m., the last cartridges were chambered, and the SS moved closer, preparing to storm the courtyard. The defenders clenched for impact, ready for a fight that would almost certainly be their last. And then, from the valley below, came the sound they had prayed for, the rumble of American tanks. The defenders of Castle Litter had been bracing for their last stand when a new sound cut through the gunfire, the low, steady rumble of tank engines. At first it was faint, buried under rifle cracks and machine gun bursts, but then it grew louder, closer, until there was no mistaking it. American armor was coming up the road. For the men on the walls, the timing was almost biblical. The SS had been tightening the noose all morning. Grappling hooks dangled from the battlements, artillery had blown chunks out of the walls, and ammunition was nearly gone. The defenders were seconds away from trading rifles for knives when salvation finally arrived. The first American tank crested the road into view, its .50 caliber already spitting fire. Machine gun tracers swept the SS positions, chewing through the tree line. Infantry poured in behind, hammering the attackers with disciplined volleys. Within minutes, the momentum shifted. The SS advance stalled, then faltered, and finally broke. One Wehrmacht soldier on the castle walls couldn't contain himself. He shouted down into the courtyard, "Amerikanische Panzer!" American tanks. For any other German soldier in 1945, that phrase meant doom. But here, in this one bizarre battle, it was a cry of joy. The SS, caught in the open and hammered by superior firepower, had no choice but to retreat. They scattered into the woods, leaving behind their dead and wounded. Within an hour, the hillsides were quiet except for the echoes of distant gunfire and the metallic clatter of empty shell casings settling into the dirt. Inside the castle, the scene was surreal. French prime ministers who had spent the night firing rifles staggered down from the ramparts. American tankers slapped hands with Wehrmacht defectors who the day before had been their enemies. Jean Barotra, having survived his mad dash through the woods, reappeared with the relief column, grinning like a man who just won the world's deadliest tennis match. And then there was Jack Lee. He had fought through the night, watched his tank burn, seen comrades fall, and was fully prepared to die with knife in hand. Now, standing in the courtyard with dust still hanging in the air, he walked up to Major John Kramer, the officer leading the relief. Lee didn't give a speech. He didn't salute. He just looked Kramer dead in the eye and said, "So, what kept you?" The exhausted men around him broke into laughter, a release of tension so sharp it bordered on hysteria. They weren't laughing because it was funny. They were laughing because they were alive. For the French VIPs, it was liberation at last. They had survived years in captivity, months in uncertainty, and one night in hell. Now they were escorted out of the castle under guard, finally free. The defenders tended to their wounded, buried their dead, and surveyed the bizarre battlefield they had just endured. A medieval castle riddled with bullet holes, a Sherman tank burning in the gateway, and the bodies of SS troops scattered in the woods below. For Major Sepp Gangl, there was no victory parade. His body lay under a sheet, killed by sniper fire during the defense. In time, Austria would honor him as a national hero, a man who turned against tyranny and gave his life protecting civilians. For the Americans, he was proof that not all Germans had been fanatics. As the sun set on May 5, 1945, Castle Itter stood battered but unbroken. Against all odds, its defenders, Americans, Germans, Austrians, and French, had held out long enough for relief to arrive. It was the battle so strange that decades later, when Jack Lee was asked about it, he didn't wax poetic. He just shrugged and said, "It was the damnedest thing." And he was right. With the SS driven off and the French prisoners liberated, Castle Itter fell quiet. The walls were scarred with bullet holes, the gateway blocked by the charred wreck of Lee's Sherman, and the courtyard littered with spent cartridges. For a few hours, the castle that had seen one of the strangest battles of the war was just a wrecked fortress full of exhausted men. The French VIPs were quickly evacuated to safety. Politicians, general, even de Gaulle's sister. They had survived Nazi captivity and, more incredibly, a firefight that should have ended in their execution. Their unlikely rescuers, a handful of American tankers, defected Wehrmacht soldiers, Austrian partisans, and one dead ex-SS officer who had decided to guard them instead of kill them, faded back into the chaos of the war's end. For the defenders, recognition came unevenly. Lieutenant Jack Lee was promoted to captain and awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, along with other decorations, including a Silver Star. His actions had been reckless, stubborn, and exactly what the moment required. Harry Bassi, who had insisted on not missing the fight, also received commendations. The African American infantrymen who volunteered their way into history were less celebrated at the time, though their role has since been remembered as proof of courage in an era of segregation. Major Sepp Gangl, the Wehrmacht officer who turned against the SS and died leading his men alongside Americans, was buried in his homeland. Austria would later name streets after him, honoring him as a national hero. His legacy was not as a German officer who fought for Hitler, but as one who fought against the SS in defense of civilians. The French, for their part, remembered Castle Itter as a bizarre interlude in their liberation, a moment when political enemies set aside rivalries long enough to survive. Even Jean Barotra, the tennis star who had sprinted through enemy fire, lived to tell the tale. His dash became one of the more improbable side notes of a battle already filled with them. And yet, in the grand scope of World War II, the Battle of Castle Itter barely registered. It was small, quick, and fought at the very end of the war. There were no sweeping campaigns, no maps redrawn, no turning points. Just one castle, one night, and a cast of characters that no novelist would have dared to invent. But it mattered. It mattered because it showed how fractured Germany had become, how some Wehrmacht officers chose conscience over loyalty, and how a handful of people on opposite sides could stand together against the worst of the SS. It mattered because, in the words of historian Stephen Harding, it was the last battle, and the final bizarre twist in a war already full of them. Years later, when Lee was asked to reflect on Castle Itter, he didn't give a grand speech. He didn't call it historic or noble or tragic. He just shook his head and said, It was the damnedest thing. And that's the Battle of Castle Itter, the strangest little battle of World War II. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.